Hola, saludos a mis amigos. Lo siento mucho que no puedo estar con usted hoy. Me siento muy honrado de ser invitado a hablar a la conferencia de ALESDA 2010. Mi mayor deseos para una conferencia maravillosa. Gracias. My sincere apologies for my Spanish, and I really wish I could be there with you. It was a wonderful invitation, and I hope that the presentation I will give for you today will be valuable and provide some interesting insights. Special greetings to a number of people, Miguel, Wanderley, Katia, Rosa and Carlos, Fernando, Ricardo, Barbara, Ana Lucia, Luz Amelia, Vanessa, Asalo, and many, many others. And I'm sorry I can't see you on this occasion, but hopefully next year. Okay, I'm going to be speaking to you today about an important topic in today's world, and that is globalization, advertising, and the colonization of sport culture. As a brief overview of where I'm going to go with this presentation today, I've provided this first slide. So I'll provide just a brief discussion of globalization, global capitalism, and advertising. And then I wish to spend a little bit of time talking about the advertising industry, something that we tend not to think too much about in relation to sport culture in today's world, especially when we think about participation in sport, but advertising will have an impact on that, as hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate. So I'll look very briefly at the origins and economics of advertising, advertising as a cultural field in the way that Bourdieu spoke of it, and then the colonization of culture, including the physical, cultural, and historical spaces that make up our world. From there, I'll talk about the colonization of sport culture by advertising, and in particular, how advertising is turning young children from citizens into consumers. And then finally, a brief comment about the impact of globalization, advertising, and our future, in particular, our environment. So to begin, let me just highlight a few statistics about the effects of globalization on our world. And I could have drawn upon many, but I'm going to use these ones. So for example, of the world's 200 largest corporations, they control 28% of the world economic activity, but actually employ less than 0.25% of the global workforce. In any given day, US $1.5 to $2 trillion is exchanged, but only 2% of this is actually related to trade in real goods and services. That means that most of the financial transactions that are going on in the world are actually electronic conversions of currencies and stocks and bonds as opposed to real commodities. Another example or piece of evidence regarding the effects of globalization. The wealth of the richest 84 people in the world is greater than the GDP, gross domestic product, of a country like China with a population of 1.3 billion. And finally, there are 5 billion people in the world today living on less than US $2 a day. These highlight some great differences in terms of economic power and influence and the distribution of resources. If we look at this brief chart here, which provides a comparison of large global corporations and nation states, you will see by comparing the red bars, which are the corporations, and the green bars that represent nations, some examples of the differences in power. If anything can be learned from this, it's the fact that corporations like General Motors, Ford, Mitsubishi, Exxon, Walmart have more economic power than many small nations, and in fact, some larger corporations. And as a point of comparison for those of you in Venezuela, you could use South Africa as a gauge in terms of its GDP. So on the one hand, there's this enormous economic power that these corporations have, but no doubt that will come to influence political and cultural power as well. Right? So what's the role of advertising in all this? Well, we have to understand advertising in relation to the system that we know as capitalism. Okay, capitalism, and I'm only using a very simplistic definition here, but you could draw upon your own. It is a market forces private enterprise system that allowed society to produce more commodities or products than it actually needed. And this, in effect, turned it into a society or a world where we had excess commodities, at least in the Western world. Okay, this is a very simple conceptualization, but one that I will try to draw upon today. So in effect, we have a system that is more now based on consumption, okay, and on profit, regardless of need. And so I often ask my students, and you can think to yourself, how many t-shirts do you own? They could be Nike t-shirts, Adidas t-shirts, or another company, and go, how many do you actually use in a given week, month, or year? In other words, we have these commodities, these products, but often we don't actually need or use them. So we've been turned into consumers. All right? The advertising industry itself, and it is an industry, emerged at the end of the 19th century. And its sole purpose was to stimulate the consumption of products that were being overproduced. That is, the producers of commodities were able to produce more than society could handle or need, so they needed a stimulation. And advertising became a very powerful economic and cultural force in stimulating consumption. Okay, so let me just provide some statistics that will highlight the economic impact of advertising. Okay, this is referring to the U.S. Okay, annual advertising spending equals U.S. $435 billion per year. Okay, it is expected to reach U.S. $2 trillion a year by the year 2020. Okay, most of us can't even conceive of $1 billion, so $1 trillion is beyond our comprehension. But let's just assume and acknowledge that it's an enormous amount of money. Beyond this, according to the United Nations Human Development Report, global advertising spending now outpaces the growth of the world economy by 1/3. That is, we are spending more advertising money to try and get more people to buy things, even though the economy itself is saying that we really should slow down. Okay. Another way of looking at advertising is not just as an economic force or an industry that's based on economics, but as a cultural field. And here I'll draw upon Pierre Bourdieu and his field of cultural production. He refers to cultural fields, that is, places where a society communicates stories about itself, its values, its morals, and the things that are important in society. Okay? We can think of advertising as a very powerful cultural field, okay? A place where stories are told. Okay? And although advertising uses humor, and sometimes it uses sex to sell products, okay, it uses a variety of other themes as well. But throughout these, one of the dominant stories that we are told through contemporary advertising, whether it be on television, radio, newspapers, magazines, or the internet, is that consumption is one path or one way of achieving happiness and success in life. And so we even have things such as new diseases like affluenza or shopaholism, where people cannot stop. They have an obsession with shopping. To highlight the extreme end of this, I draw upon a billboard that was visualized here in New Zealand some years ago by a woman named Fiona Jack, who was an art design student in Auckland. She created a billboard that basically said nothing, what you've always been looking for, and placed it in Auckland near the highways. And over time, people started calling the 1-800 number that appeared on this billboard to find out where they could in fact buy nothing. This, in a sense, highlights society's desire and perhaps compulsion for the consumption of products, turning consumption almost into a contemporary form of epidemic. All right? Highlighting the effects of all this consumption, we can look at examples like Robert Goldman and Stephen Papson's book, Sign Wars, The Cluttered Landscape of Advertising. They argue that the pressure has been on advertisers now, who are competing with other companies, to try and highlight their brand. And they refer to it this way: the circulation of signs, that is, images and symbols and brand logos, accelerates, driving a compulsive and reckless search for unoccupied cultural spaces. That is, there's an ongoing battle, a challenge, a war that is going on, fighting for cultural space for brand and sign recognition. The impact of this can be seen in many ways. So, for example, we can look at the colonization of physical space. Not only are things like NASA space launches sponsored by companies like Pizza Hut or Radio Shack or Lego, we can see this throughout the world, and in fact they are now discussing the possibility of space platforms. That is, large billboards that would appear in the sky that could then promote things. And we might soon see things like this sunset brought to you by Coca-Cola or McDonald's, highlighting the colonization of physical spaces. This can also be seen in the realm of popular culture. We now have a whole industry that is called product placement that occurs in television and movie production. So, for example, on the left you will see various advertisers, companies that are trying to sell their products, such as Adidas. And on the right-hand side, you'll see film producers, owners of major corporations. And in between, you'll see a small box that has the label placement agencies. And there are a large number of these in Hollywood and throughout the world. Their job, and their sole job, is to make connections and deals between the advertisers of products and the film producers, whereby the film producers and actors guarantee that they will put in particular brands to highlight them, in effect offering a contemporary form of advertising. So let's take one actor, Tom Hanks, whom you may know, and a few of the movies that he's performed in, and you will see some examples of the way in which advertising and product placement occurs. So in a movie like You've Got Mail, you have America Online, an internet provider, or Starbucks being referred to throughout the movie. Or in the movie Castaway, we have FedEx, a transportation delivery service. And within that, even a major character known as Wilson, who is a volleyball. And it just so happens that Wilson is a major producer and brand of volleyball. And that name Wilson was repeated throughout the agency. And of course, you might be familiar with Tom Hanks' movie Forrest Gump, where products like Dr. Pepper, Nike, and a wide range of others were all inserted, again, to provide brand exposure and a form of advertising. Okay? That's a form of physical colonization of space, but we also have a kind of colonization of our history and memory. So as one example, let me use Macintosh Apple computers. A number of years ago, they came out with a campaign featuring very prominent individuals in world history, such as Martin Luther King, Albert Einstein, Gandhi, and as a sporting example, Jackie Robinson, who was a Major League Baseball player and the first one to break the color barrier in American baseball. The whole notion of this campaign was a very nice message about how to think outside the box, how to challenge the rules and regulations and advance society and make it a better place. But maybe we need to step back and think about the moral and ethical issues that are involved in using these people who contributed so much more to society and probably stood for a lot more than just a brand of contemporary computers. All right? So where does sport fit in all this? Well, although it seem like a minor player in the world of global capitalism, it is actually extremely important. Sport has enormous appeal for advertisers. I mentioned earlier that advertisers often use sex or humor to promote particular brands and make their advertisements, but sport is a very powerful vehicle for communicating certain messages. And here's why. First, it attracts large and very passionate, loyal audiences. And we can see that in any nation that follows football. Second, sport as a form of cultural production, as a cultural practice and televised form of entertainment is relatively cheap to produce compared to something like contemporary movies or even TV shows and sitcoms. Okay? Sport provides human drama. It shows real people testing the limits of the human body, and we can relate that. Most of us have had a chance to run and to jump to see how high or how far we could do a certain event. We are able to see people who are at the extreme end of the limits of the human body doing things that seem unfathomable. Okay? Fourth, sport offers us both heroes and villains, people to aspire to, people to despise, which attracts interest. And finally, sport offers strong links to both health and nationalism. And again, any major sporting event, the FIFA World Cup, will draw our attention and bring out those nationalistic sentiments that we all hold within, though sometimes we may try to argue we don't actually have. All right? And it's important for me to note that the idea of sport advertising and sport sponsorship itself is not a new phenomenon. We can go back to the origins of the Tour de France, for example. In 1903, the Tour de France was started as a publicity event, some would say a publicity stunt, for the newspaper L'Auto, which is now referred to as L'Équipe, the team, which had yellow pages. Okay? This particular paper emerged, okay, to compete with L'Aveille, okay, which was the dominant and basically one of the most dominant French newspapers at the time, with a readership of over 800,000 people daily. Okay? In order to compete with that, this event, this sporting event, the Tour de France, was almost invented, and of course that is where the yellow jersey for the Tour de France actually comes from. It didn't happen by accident. It's actually a form of early sports sponsorship and therefore sport advertising. Okay? We can look at sport advertising in a much wider complex to try and understand why it is such a powerful phenomenon in today's society. For example, we can look at the conjuncture and the cooperation that occurs between large global media companies such as News Corporation, Viacom, Disney, Time Warner, General Electric, and AT&T. And then I've just highlighted a few of the major global sport corporations, whether it be the IOC, International Olympic Committee, FIFA, and a range of others that some of you will be familiar with. The combined power and influence of those media companies, the global sport organizations like the IOC and FIFA, in conjunction with the companies that offer sponsorship through all of these companies and technologies, provide a powerful force to reach a global audience that most of us are aware of today. And this is leading to the way in which sport culture is now being influenced, and we could argue, and the argument I'm putting forth today, is that we are seeing a colonization of sport culture that has been occurring for a long time. So in terms of the colonization of sporting spaces, I've offered here a few examples. We can see in the upper left-hand corner a boxer like Bo Hopkins, who was paid $100,000 to get a tattoo permanently put on his back to promote a particular casino in Las Vegas. We can see bridges that form sporting images but also include sporting brands like Adidas. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, we can see something like the biathlon, where there are skiers who then shoot. And the magic moment is when the skiers actually stop to concentrate and are therefore fixed. And you can just try and count yourself the number of corporate logos that appear within that small little image. It's enormous. If we look in the middle of the screen, we can see two football fields. One, a blank football field, and on the right, Coca-Cola. This is the new virtual technology, whereby playing fields can be a blank sheet, allowing advertisers from all over the world to buy virtual space and therefore reach their national or local audiences. Okay? To the right of that, we see NASCAR and other forms, or Formula One, other forms of auto racing, which are very powerful, some of the highest attended sporting events in the world. And almost every element and aspect of those cars and the drivers have corporate logos on top of them. Even when there's an accident and the hood, for example, of the car flies off, underneath it you will see corporate logos, because that is an opportunity to promote a brand. And in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a recent example from New Zealand, a kind of ambush marketing where an individual was paid by, in this case, Vodafone, a mobile phone service, to run naked and stalk the field, holding up the game, but also providing an enormous magic moment of global advertising. That's the colonization of sporting spaces, or a few examples. But let me provide an example of the colonization of history and memory. Here I'm going to draw upon the company CKX. And you may not be familiar with CKX, but CKX is the company that owns the rights to programs and TV shows which are now global, such as American Idol, but also Elvis Presley Enterprise. CKX owns 85% of Elvis Presley Enterprises, which includes things like the Cirque du Soleil, Viva Elvis, his home, Graceland, in Memphis, Tennessee, and things like Facebook and the sponsorship of Facebook, which now has 700,000 Elvis fans attached to it. Now, why Elvis? Well, if you read the quote at the top, Elvis, although he died in 1977, over 30 years ago, you can see the quote, "Interest in Elvis remains strong and the brand is constantly being refreshed." That's because in 2009 alone, the Elvis brand, not a person anymore, he's a brand, earned US $60 million. And at this point in time has 260 corporate licenses, including Mattel toys and American greeting cards. So his label, his name, his image is offered as a form of corporate sponsorship throughout the world at an enormous price. Now, there are ethical and moral dimensions here, but you're still probably wondering, what has this got to do with sport? What does Elvis have to do with sport? Well, only this year, Nike Football, in conjunction with FIFA, released a television commercial, which most of you will have seen, that featured not Elvis in terms of his image, but a song by Elvis called A Little Less Conversation, A Little More Action. So we have the articulation or the linkage of a global corporation, Nike, with advertising industries, with FIFA, that is a large international sport organization, drawing upon a dead person and a dead person's image to be used within contemporary advertising. Obviously, there are moral, and ethical implications of this, but also it should make us step back and wonder, is this okay, or should we be concerned? Okay? Well, I want to put forth the case that we probably should be concerned, and at this point I want to highlight a few cases and examples drawing upon the linkage and impact of global capitalism, advertising, and the branding of contemporary identity. And you'll notice that I started off with a couple of babies because even they are not immune to their use within contemporary advertising. Now, these may make us smile at the exaggerated use of particular logos on babies, and I'm sure there really isn't a Nike tattoo on that baby, it's superimposed, but it should make us wonder about why we think it's okay or why these images are so common in today's society. So let me refer to the work of Henri Giroux, who's written a book, amongst many others, called Stealing Innocence, Corporate Culture's War on Children. And he argues that as culture becomes increasingly commercialized, the only type of citizenship that adult society offers to children is that of consumerism. That is, children are being turned into innocent people and citizens of society, into potential and actual consumers who can buy the products of large corporations. So let me just provide a couple of startling quotes, or at least I hope they will appear a little bit shocking to you. The first, quote, "The consumer embryo, that is the unborn child, the fertilized egg, the consumer embryo begins to develop during the first year of existence. Children continue their consumer journey in infancy, and they certainly deserve consideration as consumers at that time." Quote, "At 6 months of age, the same age they are imitating simple sounds like mama, babies are forming mental images of corporate logos and mascots." And this from a kids marketing expert named James McNeil. The fact that there is such a person or a position as a marketing expert for children ought to make us step back and think maybe there's a bit of a danger here. But I hope that provides an illustration of the way in which global corporations are thinking about children as potential consumers. So let me provide some statistical analysis, and here are some examples from the United States again. Of course, I realize that Venezuela is not in the U.S. and is about as far away from it ideologically as can be. So here we have an example. 52 million kids under the age of 12 live in the United States, spending US $40 billion annually. That's enormous impact on the economy, and it's being further recognized by global corporations and the advertising agencies that work for them. But kids don't just spend that money. Kids under the age of 12 also influence, on an increasing level, the spending of their parents to the level of US $700 billion. And that total, just that number, US $700 billion, is equal to the combined economies of the world's 115 poorest countries. This is somewhat shocking in terms of the economic impact that these children have and is being recognized by global corporations so it can be channeled into consumption. It's now entered the stage where global corporations and advertising agencies are now stalking. They're calling it a form of scientific stalking of young children to try and analyze what they think and the way they might be able to influence their consumption buying behavior. So let's look at the way things have changed. And again, I'm drawing upon the US, but let's look at just a simple 30-year period and how it's changed in the United States in terms of children's spending. If we look at a period around the 1980s, children made up about 4% of the spending in US society. 4%, and that was still worth $4.2 billion. By the year 2010, just 30 years later, that had risen at a rate of 30% or more per year to US $40 billion. So something happened around 1980. Well, we had more TV coverage, we had more advertising, but it was something much more fundamental than that. It was actually a US government regulation, and it was referring to the regulation of advertising in the United States. So I'm going to refer here to a specific Federal Trade Commission Improvements Act, which emerged in 1980. And this is what it stated. Quote, "The Commission, that is the Regulatory Commission, which regulates advertising, shall not have any authority to promulgate, that is, regulate or influence, any rule in the children's advertising proceeding pending of the date of the Federal Commission Improvements Act." So we have this word called Improvements Act of 1980, and all it allowed was that global corporations now had free rein to advertise to children almost anytime and wherever they pleased. There are still regulations about certain programming and when certain types of advertising can appear on television, but in terms of trying to attract television through Saturday morning cartoons, etc., it was an open game. And therefore, you can see the dramatic increase in spending by advertisers, but also how it influenced children's spending down the line. What's changing in the world? Well, now children are targets. They are the targets of market and advertising research companies that look at children and people as potential consumers. So a quote from Douglas Rushkoff, "They don't call it human research or people research, they call it market research." How are they going about this? Well, here are a few examples. Most of us are familiar with focus groups. Well, they'll bring young people and adults together to try and see what they think about particular products and their knowledge about particular brands. This has been extended into what we might call contemporary forms of marketing or advertising ethnography, where companies go out and they are taking pictures of particular individuals that they consider to be cool. And therefore you see this term cool hunting, which is what advertisers are looking for, particularly with the youth market. They will take photographs of tattoos, strange hairstyles, clothing styles, and then bring it back and sell it to particular companies as they make profiles. They hold social events, sometimes in conjunction with major TV shows like music TV in the US. They'll hold rock concerts and do ethnographic research there. We have culture spies, where companies actually hire young people to go into chat boxes and chat networks on the internet to try and talk and insert the names of brands into conversations when they are talking about what their lives are like, the problems they're having with their boyfriends and girlfriends, etc., etc. Okay? A form of cultural spying. And perhaps the most dramatic example I can offer is the emergence of the GIA. Not the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, but the GIA, the Girls Intelligence Agency, which is a kind of slumber party or pajama party whereby corporations combine through marketing companies to provide a kit which provides prizes and all kinds of incentives for holding these parties. And in turn, these slumber parties, which often feature young girls, get together and they must talk about specific products and provide feedback to these companies. In essence, the children are now doing research on themselves and providing it back to research companies. The world has changed a lot in the last 100 years. Okay? A couple of more examples of this, and perhaps my colleagues in Mexico will be able to discuss in greater detail some of these. Here's an example of the way it's influencing children's consumption behavior. In Mexico City, there's a theme park whereby children buy tokens when they enter this theme park. And they can ride around in little cars and go on little rides, but the entire amusement park or entertainment park is branded by global corporations such as General Motors, Avis Rental Car, and many others. When children run out of their tokens, they are then invited to work in a small way for Pizza Hut, McDonald's, or other corporations so that they learn that they need to earn money, and the sole purpose of earning that money is to buy products of particular brands of products. This should be something that arouses our suspicion, if not our concern. Another example, there is now a company in the United States called the Field Trip Factory. Its slogan, uniting commerce, communities, and classrooms. This is a company whose sole purpose is to organize educational field trips for schools. Now, that might seem like a nice thing. It will help teachers and school boards ensure the safety of their children. The problem is where they are taking these children and what's going on. They aren't just going to museums, and they aren't just going to art galleries. They are now going to commercial chain stores, such as the Sports Authority. And this is where they're getting their knowledge about sport, fitness, exercise, and other things, all aligned with the brands and therefore the advertising of specific sport companies. Okay. We can look at this in another realm, a company that you might be familiar with, that is Disney Corporation, which certainly has its interest in terms of the ownership of particular sport media networks and sport teams and facilities. You may be familiar, but if not, I recommend you to have a look at a documentary by the Media Education Foundation called The Mickey Mouse Monopoly, Disney Childhood and Corporate Power. In this documentary, they talk about the ways in which Disney movies have for long and continue to shape the way young people and older people think about things like gender, racial and ethnic identities, and sexual identities. And these often are through the reproduction of particular racial, gender-type stereotypes. But underneath all this, there's a bigger concern. And if we take a quote here from the former CEO of Disney, Michael Eisner, we see in an internal memo, not meant for public viewing or consumption. And he states, "We have no obligation to make history. We have no obligation to make art. We have no obligation to make a statement. To make money is our only objective." This from a person in charge of shaping the lives of millions, if not billions, of children around the world through a very powerful form of popular culture, be it movies, and now, of course, those movies and their themes are attached to commercial products through toys, and also the sale of those toys and images at McDonald's, Burger King, Pizza Hut, and elsewhere. Okay? Taking this to the next step, you may be wondering, well, of course, advertising is important, but how is it linked with global capitalism, and what are the wider implications? Well, in terms of not just sporting culture, but all forms of culture, advertising and its influence in conjunction with contemporary global capitalism isn't just about the colonization of physical spaces or elements of popular culture. It has a real impact on our society. So let me take a quote from media theorist Soot Jolly, who talks about advertising at the edge of the apocalypse, basically the end of the world. And he puts it this way: "I wish to make a simple claim. 20th century advertising is the most powerful and sustained system of propaganda in human history, and its cumulative cultural effects, unless quickly checked, will be responsible for destroying the world as we know it. As it achieves this, it will be responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of non-Western peoples and will prevent the peoples of the world from achieving true happiness. Simply stated, our survival as a species is dependent upon minimizing the threat from the advertising and the commercial culture that has spawned it. Now, the reason that Subtitulado makes this enormous, dramatic statement is because he is trying to highlight the fact that the overproduction of consumer commodities led to the emergence of this thing called advertising, a powerful economic and cultural force that was solely invented to stimulate the consumption of commodities and products that we don't necessarily need. That, of course, is going to have an impact on the environment. The production of all these products, whether they happen to be volleyballs, basketballs, soccer balls, tennis rackets, but even if we think about sport and sport travel, the carbon footprint left by teams and fans traveling the world to attend these events is going to have and is having an impact on our lives. So here we can see, as Subtitulado puts it, a kind of graph that looks at how things have changed over time in terms of what's available to us. So on the left-hand side, you will see the available natural resources that we have in the world in comparison to what's going to be available as a consequence of consumption in terms of time. So from 1950 to 2070, which is a year he predicts will be, and many environmentalist experts predict, we will have this crisis moment when the natural resources available are going to be stretched and impacted upon and challenged by the amount of consumption going on in the world, keeping in mind that the population of the world is rising. We're going to face some serious consequences. Okay? The lack of oil, the lack of clean air, and in particular, what many are talking about as what could be the basis for the next world war, God forbid there is one, which will be clean water, which is becoming in short supply. So you can see that this colonization of culture by advertising doesn't just have consequences for what we see and what we buy, but over the long term in terms of perhaps our very future. And I hope that this, in its own way, highlights what Subtitulado concludes with, which is quite a dramatic statement. In the last 50 years, we have used as much of the world's resources as the entire history of humankind. Clearly, this is a serious statement to make, and there will be debates about how real this is and whether it will have the effects that Joly and many environmental experts actually say it will. But it is something that I think we need to consider, and we need to consider in relation to the world that we live in. That is a world of globalization, of global capitalism, a paradigm that has come to shape the way that we live our lives and the way that we think about how we're supposed to live those lives, especially in the West. And much of that is based around the kinds of products we live, the lifestyle we live, and the commodities that we buy. So on that note, I would like to say gracias, thank you very much, and I would also simply like to draw your attention and invite you next year to the ISSA Conference and World Congress in Havana, Cuba, and we will definitely be having sessions in Spanish for all of you, and I welcome you to contact me at any time for more information about that. Many thanks, hola, gracias, and see you next time.